Good afternoon and welcome back to Project Vertical. Many of you were able to come to the first meeting, and this is sort of a follow-up of what we discussed that day with a few minor changes or updates to some of the topics that we covered. Please forgive me, this is the first time I'm using this platform, so it may be a little awkward at first, but hopefully you'll get the information that we would otherwise discuss in person. As a quick review, this is currently the schematic of the courses that we have and the order in which those happen and which courses feed into other courses. Keep in mind though that clinical reasoning is technically a clinical course and not under the umbrella of the diagnosis department. However, because it is so integral to a lot of the concepts that are covered in diagnosis, I'm including it here as well. Many of you were part of the original proposal change that Dr. Hudson was involved in writing, and this is a schematic of kind of those courses and how those would fall and in what quarter you would have those courses. If you look to your left, you'll see that the head and neck, visceral, and TLP courses are down in that left-hand corner. Those have been moved earlier in the curriculum. And then you'll also notice that case history has been moved to the 6th quarter. And an introductory to differential diagnosis and management has been added. Also, there's a CCM Case Review 1 and CCM Case Review 2 in 10th and 11th quarter. I know you guys do not have the syllabi in front of you related to each one of these courses, but essentially head, neck, visceral, TLP would remain the same, cover the same topics, just occur earlier. Intro to diagnosis, differential diagnosis and management would really be the beginning of teaching the students the 8 steps, also going through what is a differential diagnosis, definitely an entry-level course. So it makes sense that that would have to be covered before you actually get to the case history. CCM Case Review 1 and 2, those, the rubrics, or excuse me, the syllabi are a little bit different in that those courses haven't existed before, and I believe that those were meant to really review cases that were happening in the clinic and sort of mimic that grand rounds type of situation where you took actual live patient cases and reviewed those in class. That is an area that I want to discuss with you guys. Again, this is the original proposal, and there's some things that as a group I think we came up with that we need to tweak. I know some people kind of prefer to see this in a written form, so I also included for you the current courses to your left so you know when those are actually occurring, and then how those translate over into the proposed courses. Again, this is the original proposal, or what I'm terming option 1. So one of the key concepts that we need to work on in the diagnosis department is which diagnoses are covered in which course. And one thing that we began to realize is the systemic DDXs are really sprinkled throughout. And that is good in one sense, but in another sense it could almost be its own category. So I toyed with the idea of creating a systemic diagnosis course and separate all of those DDXs out of the other classes. And you can see that to the left. And again, this was just an option, action number 2, if you will. The other thing is when I reviewed the syllabi for CCM Case Review 1 and Case Review 2, they essentially sounded like the same course. One covered visceral, one covered head and neck. What the description sounded like, sounded as if you were taking multiple conditions from the previous courses and taking into account a patient that may have a couple of comorbidities, and how do you differentiate those and diagnose those and manage those. So what I'm proposing is that we maybe change the name, because I know students, when they see case review 1, case review 2, I think having a separate entity would be advantageous. And changing that name to a more descriptive name of what it actually does, as in differential diagnosis and management of comorbidities, would really make it concrete what that course is about and what it's covering. And then when you get to CCM case review, you can actually in 11th quarter have enough patient interaction that they could bring in individual cases from cases that they have in the clinic and discuss those with other interns or the class if they want to bring in teaching points about what they've learned while treating that particular patient. That would be the place to do that type of grand rounds, if you will. Again, this is just a different way of looking at those changes to get a better idea of the flow. This particular slide was a scenario that we could consider, but I think since developing this course of action number 3, we've sort of decided against it. But I just wanted to include it so you would understand the thought process and some interesting changes that we talked about as a group. If you'll notice in 5th quarter, we changed the name of that beginning course to Intro to Clinical Diagnosis. One, because the former name was Differential Diagnosis and Management, and they're not really at that point yet. And so that name was going to be confusing, I think, as we push this proposal through, because obviously the first question that would be asked would be, how can you do differential diagnosis and management before you've actually had a case history class? And really they're not doing a whole lot of differential diagnosing in that course, or management for that matter. So changing the name to Intro to Clinical Diagnosis was a little more descriptive and true to what will be taking place in that course. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can also see where we talked about potentially combining the visceral, systemic, and autoimmune into one course. We have since decided that was probably not a great idea once I received all of the diagnosis lists from everyone, and that list was pretty exhaustive. There's no way to cover that much material in that visceral course. So bear in mind that was just an option. The other thing that I do want to show you on this that was carried through was a new concept in 7th quarter called clinical integration. And what clinical integration would look like would be if you were to take these courses, case history, physical exam, and ortho neuro 1, and think of it as an entrance exam, huge station, where you could take pieces of a case history, pieces of a phys exam, pieces of an ortho exam, and say, okay, here's a patient that has this, 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 and this. Now integrate that information to come up with a diagnosis. So it's how to begin the process of teaching the students to think outside of that one course and start integrating that clinical information. And you may say, well, isn't that what clinical reasoning is supposed to do? Theoretically, yes, it is. However, I think if we were to make this an integration course and specifically have practicals that point them in that direction, it would be more advantageous. Then we can change clinical reasoning to actually be more of what it sounds like. You're reasoning through how to clinically take care of someone, and we'll get to that in just a second. So those are a couple of key items on this slide. The other aspect that I would like to point out, and this is something that Dr. York and I had discussed as being an advantageous situation for students, would be if we actually moved Ortho Neuro 1 and 2 earlier in the curriculum. Now, this is a huge undertaking, a lot bigger than I initially thought. And I'll show you why in just a minute. So if we clean this up a little bit, you'll see that we're going back to the 3 courses, head and neck, TLP, and visceral, and keeping those systemic conditions kind of sprinkled in those, but we'll be very deliberate about who teaches what topic and where those need to fit in each one of those courses. And I think after we clean up the diagnoses and really separate those out, we'll have a lot more distinction between some of those courses, so we won't have as much overlap. Now, in this particular scenario, we have moved Ortho 1 and Ortho 2 to 5th and 6th quarter, which feeds into our clinical integration, and also that allows for the students to have that information a lot sooner, which helps them build that information into other courses, as in case history and also in clinical diagnosis, intro to clinical diagnosis. She can start talking about some of those specific questions that relate more to the areas of, like if you have a shoulder condition, she can pinpoint, let's talk about some shoulder questions that you may want to ask, and that they are a little more able to do that type of thing if they've had some ortho. The clinical reasoning, I want you to kind of think of that as an intro to that differential diagnosis and management of comorbidities. Again, here's that list in a different format. Okay, and I've left out a lot of steps involved with the hours per quarter. Every time that I went through one of these options and scenarios, and even the initial proposal that Dr. Hudson designed had all of the different hourly changes per quarter. And when you start shifting courses around, it drastically can change a quarter. This is sort of the most recent model, that option 3.1 as I'm calling it, the most radical of all of the changes, just to put some numbers down to see if it's actually feasible to do. Again, this is where if you look at quarter 4, let's see if I could get a marker going on here. Okay, so if you look at quarter 4, you can see that case history will now be taken out. That's what the A no course means. So that gives you a minus 22 out of that quarter. So you're down to a quarter of 385. Okay, it started at 407. Quarter 5, you would take that CDC M1 and take that out. And in this particular proposal, we would be trying to shift Ortho Neuro 1 into the 5th quarter. The issue, clearly, is that Ortho is a huge course. It's 55 hours, and technically, if it were more hours, that would be even better. But at the minimum, it's 55 hours. And then if we added that intro to clinical diagnosis, which is that precursor to case history, it's a 2-hour, meets 2 hours a week. That's your 22 hours here. You've essentially added a gain of 44 hours. So you go from 374 to 418. That's a huge quarter. About 407 is the most I've seen on any of the schedules currently. But as of right now, I'm not going to concern us with that because other courses are also trying to go under review. Technique courses may be moved. Every department is also trying to work their own curriculum proposals. So those are subject to change. Now, if we move down to quarter 6, we've taken ortho neuro out because we've moved it up. We're adding case history to this quarter, and now ortho 2 kind of takes the place of ortho 1 because of the shift or move up. And again, that gives you that 55, and so again you're ending up for this quarter as well 418. So those would be 2 heavy hitting quarters. We have some G10 courses in there that are eating up some of our hours, so that's something that potentially, if some of those were shifted, we may be able to alleviate some of those. Quarter 7, now that's where Ortho Neuro 2 would have normally been. We're taking that out, and this is where we're adding the head and neck and TLP, and then the new course, Clinical Integration. Okay. Even adding those courses, we still have a good range for our hours here, 341. This was a very light quarter to begin with. It was only 297, so they kind of needed some more hours. Now, if you look at quarter 8, which is the entrance exam quarter or preclinic quarter, they typically are taking CDCM2 concurrently. With this model, that would be removed, and this is where your visceral differential diagnosis management would be. This gives us a net change of 0 here, so no real change to the hours. If you look at quarter 9, we're taking out the CCM1 and Diagnosis Review 1. And this is where I'm proposing we would move that clinical reasoning course. And I really want you guys to think of it not as the same clinical reasoning. I almost would like to use a different name, but it's essentially a different format or a different topic in clinical reasoning than it currently has been. That would bring you to 275. So sort of a light quarter there. And then quarter 10, the CCM2 courses, of course, have been moved up. And this is where your differential diagnosis and management of comorbidities course would come in. So you're actually decreasing this quarter to 362. And then quarter 11, again, the CCM has been moved up. And then you have your diagnosis and case management review course. And Dr. Hudson has had it listed as an observation course, but that's something that we'll need to discuss how we want that class to look in the end. And that has it at 334. Believe it or not, the overall impact here is a 0 change. So just to reiterate that clinical integration course, students would take the elements of the case history, the physical exam, the ortho-neuro, lab findings, everything they've learned up until that point to determine a diagnosis. Up until that point, the students have really just been looking at one particular area of study to come up with their diagnosis. And this class begins that process of integrating those different patient presentations to determine what the bigger picture or what the bigger diagnosis should be. Practicals would be a part of this course, an integral part of this course, to make sure that the students are integrating that knowledge and preparing them for that clinical setting where they will have a patient sitting in front of them who may give them 4 or 5 different symptoms that seem unrelated, but the student has to be able to start formulating a diagnosis from those types of symptoms. The clinical reasoning course would now become focused on helping the students with the basic procedures for managing outpatient care in the clinic. Up until this point, students really feel like they're being thrown to the wolves when they get to clinic. They don't really know how to come up with a care plan. They don't know really how they should treat a patient. This is where the clinical reasoning needs to come in. A student needs to be almost handheld through the process of utilizing their knowledge that they're gaining from the patient history, exam, diagnostic imaging, and they need to be walked through the process of how to develop an appropriate care plan and manage the care of a patient based on whether they have an acute, a subacute, or a chronic condition. And then also in this course, they need to better understand how their treatment of that patient relates to other healthcare providers. And we talked about this in our initial meeting, the Metacompetency 8. This is where that Metacompetency 8 really comes into play, that interprofessional collaboration. Are we teaching them how to co-manage, how to refer, and how to look at a patient's condition and decide if it's something that does warrant other care besides chiropractic care? That's really what I believe this clinical reasoning course needs to be geared towards, and that prepares them for that following course of differentially diagnosing a patient that has multiple conditions. And that's a higher level thinking process to say, okay, this patient has high blood pressure, this patient has diabetes, this patient has neuropathy, what symptom is coming from what condition, or what is there an underlying condition that I'm missing because I think it's related to their diabetes when in fact it's a whole separate condition. That upper level thinking really needs to be developed in that particular area, and that's where that information will really be honed in on for the student. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we have a curriculum review meeting that is scheduled for May 7th at 11 o'clock. And I know that a lot of other departments are also coming up with some changes that they would like to implement. And we need to collectively decide which option of these that we like. If you guys would prefer to go the less invasive route and stick with maybe the original proposal or a slightly tweaked version of that, we can certainly discuss that as a group. I do think it's like pulling a Band-Aid off. If we're going to make changes, I think we need to shoot for the big picture of the big changes we want to make. And I know moving ortho 1 and 2 earlier in the curriculum puts a big monkey wrench into the hours that happen per quarter. But honestly, I think it sets up a better learning outcome for the students, a better flow of information. And that's really what I want us to focus on as you're looking through some of these is, does this make sense? The flow of information, does it make sense for the student? Is this how we're going to get them from point A to point B? Because right now, it's broken. They feel like they're getting off of the bus and there's no tour guide. What we need to do is make sure when they get to clinic and they feel like they've been dropped off into a new country, that they don't feel completely oblivious to the environment. And some of these new courses like that clinical integration, I think, will be a great starting point. If we want to go that route, we have to keep in mind that means we also have to send this to academic affairs. There are a lot of steps involved, and the sooner we can make a decision, the quicker we can get those processes underway and have headway, because I need to get something sort of decided in the works before that curriculum review, or at least have something that I want to bring to their attention during that meeting. Once you guys have watched this video and have some thoughts, I would love for you to post them on the Schoology site, and then please comment back and forth, and we can basically have a collaboration even though we couldn't have a face-to-face meeting. I appreciate your time, and let me know what you think about this new format. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.